Russia's seasonal offensive has collapsed, and the price for having no strategic gain whatsoever, nearly 210,000 casualties. Over 1,200 Russian tanks, over 7,000 artillery pieces have been turned into scrap. Russia, the world's biggest country, the one with the most territory, has lost territory in Ukraine since 2022. For that matter, it has lost territory inside of Russia since 2022. And despite over 1 million casualties since 2022, it has gained a total of less than 3% of Ukrainian land. But the real story, the one that will determine this war's outcome, is not happening on the battlefield. It is in the silent, vicious power struggle now erupting inside the Kremlin. You see, the wave of arrested generals, it has nothing to do with fighting corruption. It does, though, have everything to do with consolidating power. Consider this. Before the invasion, a general's arrest was quite a rare event. There were only 2 generals arrested in the 26 months before the invasion. However, after the invasion, that number has exploded to 19 in just 42 months. That is a nearly 6-fold increase in the course of the war. So what's going on now, what we see happening inside of Russia, is something different than what the press might tell you. What it is not reform. It is a mafia war. Clans are fighting to the death over shrinking spoils of war. From a war machine that is now bleeding money, metal, and men. Each arrest is a move to seize cash flows, to take away from rivals their ability to have a network that functions. This is turning a regime upon itself. The infighting now is all occurring while its army is burning in Ukraine. Today, Putin's Kremlin is at the very precipice. Things are quickly spinning out of control, and every arrest is buying control in Moscow. However, it is selling defeat on the front lines. My name is Jason Smart, and I'm here in Kyiv, Ukraine. And as you know, I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post, and I also happen to be an advisor on national security. So what's interesting right now inside of Russia is that the situation is truly incredible. Now, we've discussed the arrest of generals before. I've been following this very closely for a long time. However, today's video, it took me hours upon hours to research because what I found was simply incredible. I reached some pretty stunning conclusions, which I will share with you in the next few minutes, because the staggering losses are not triggering a change of strategy by the Russian military. In fact, they're triggering a war for survival among Putin's inner circle. What we are witnessing is a system consuming itself. They're doing this, of course, while pretending to clean house. But in fact, the accelerating pace of these arrests make it very clear that this is a systemic campaign to seize control. And once again, we never see this in the mainstream press. They talk about Russia taking some village that has a population of 0 or some abandoned farmland. But they don't talk about the fact that the entire Putin regime is truly skating on thin ice. And though I wrote my master's and doctoral dissertations about the Putin regime, I've studied it for more than 15 years, I would have never imagined it would reach this point. This is truly incredible. It is Russia that needs a peace deal, not Ukraine. So please help me get this truth of what is really happening here in Ukraine to more people. And it costs you nothing, but it helps me greatly. And it helps get the truth about the situation to more people. That Russia is desperate, not Ukraine. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member today. So the FSB strategy in these arrests is pretty simple. They're going after the 4 pillars of the Russian military. Now, by capturing these levers, they leave the army as a hollowed-out shell, a shell that will not be able to fight back. So first they went for the gatekeepers, those who are in charge of gatekeeping command, and they went after the ability to turn secrets into power. So first they went after Lieutenant General Yuri Kuznetsov, who was the military's personnel chief, and that was a masterstroke. So in Russia, as you're well enough to know, there is a pretty corrupt system within the military. Any promotion requires bribes or illegal favors, or else you're not going to get promoted. And Kuznetsov was in charge of choosing who got promoted. So when the FSB searched his office, they found his unofficial ledgers that showed who paid how much and when for what positions. So the FSB was able to capture something that is absolutely priceless in the Russian system, and that is called kompromat. The Russian word means compromising material, and it is the currency of power in Russia. With this kompromat, the FSB now has blackmail on the entire officer corps of Russia. They can now control any general anytime simply by threatening to expose them. The FSB then can also collect every month extortion money from them, making very clear that if they don't pay, they will go to jail. But then they made sure that the money supply for the rivals of the FSB, it was choked off. They arrested Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov. And that was all about a lot more than just seizing some bank accounts. So you see, in Russia, it is a person, a man, not a system that approves payments. Ivanov, he was in charge of approving military construction. Now, you recall he was the right hand of a former Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu was forced out by Putin last year. But this signature of Ivanov, his signature controlled billions of dollars in contracts. And the very moment, though, he was arrested, his power, it vanished. The entire pipeline of money froze instantly. So then the subordinates got very nervous. They then also worried anything they signed could then lead to their own arrest, and they feared signing anything. But the FSB stepped in. It filled that vacuum, and it helped to fix that paralysis. Because it showed up to the contractors, and it made very clear, listen, the old boss is gone. If you want to get paid, you now have to work with our companies. And this is how they seize control. They redirect the massive cash flows to their own loyalist networks. This was a full spectrum assault on the military's treasury. But aside from this full spectrum assault on the military's treasury, they went after every other branch of it possible. So they purged the top of the logistics chain. They went after General Bulgakov and Deputy Minister Pavel Popov. They went after military construction. They arrested Andrei Bokov and state contracts by detaining Vladimir Verteletsky. They dismantled depot-level corruption. They arrested General Denis Putilov for taking over $1,400,000 in bribes for tank repairs. They even seized on the medical procurements. They went after General Konstantin Kuvishnov. He embezzled over $570,000. But those are all things that we probably would have expected. But then they did something really interesting. They moved to blind the rivals. They went to make it impossible for the rivals to even communicate securely within the military. So what they did was the FSB accomplished this by arresting two consecutive heads of the Signal Corps, General Arsenalanov and General Shamarnin. Why this matters? These men controlled every radio, every satellite phone, and every encrypted network in the army. By removing them, the FSB could install its own loyalist to run the system. Now, army commanders cannot trust even their own radios. They must assume that the FSB is listening to every command and tracking every position. This makes planning a surprise quite difficult. But right now, this also gives the FSB even more leverage. But the last thing they did, the sort of interesting part, is that they took control over the state's muscle. They are decapitating Rosgvardia. They arrested Colonel General Stroganov for a staggering $20 million case. They purged his command by taking down General Mizraev for $1,400,000 bribe. They took down General Rybakov for a $150,000 bribe. These are all things they're doing to make sure that their opponents are neutered, that they will no longer pose a threat to them, and that all cash will flow through them. But that's happening across the country, and it's not just the FSB. We see across the country, those with power are trying to consolidate it as fast as they can. Why did this not happen for the past 25 years? It's a good question. The reason it's happening now is because the country is running out of money, and there is obviously an intense power battle. There seems to be a lot of concern that there could be significant political changes in the immediate term. This is not what normally happens. This is not normal for Russia. This happens when they are about to have significant problems. We could assume that this could be one of several things, whether it's the fall of Putin, guaranteeing that they choose his successor, or even leading to a coup. Because look what happened in St. Petersburg. Three generals, Umnov, Abakumov, and Semenov, they were given sentences to up to 12 years. They had all claimed that this was being done by their rivals, that it was all staged in order for their opponents to take control of the power. But this is fascinating. Why all at the same time? Why are so many people, for instance, Major General Konstantin Oganoko, he was the commander of Moscow's air and missile defense. He was arrested for bribery. He oversaw the command that guarded Moscow's skies. Look what's happening, for instance, in St. Petersburg. Even there, we see that three different generals were convicted. Now, those generals all claimed that they were being forced out in staged cases, that they were being worked against by people trying to consolidate power. And frankly, when you look at this, it does have all the marks of trying to consolidate power. And what is very important to note about this is that it's quite Russian. There is information of corruption for every single Russian general. There's no doubt about it. But why dust off those cases now? Why go out of your way to investigate them today? It's simply because it's convenient politically. The FSB understands this is their opportunity to seize control. This is their opportunity to make sure that it is them that has the power, that nobody from the military can challenge them. And looking at the people they've gone after, those that have controlled the money, those that have control of the logistics, those that have control of the command structure. Without them, how do you continue? How can you continue as an independent military? The fact is that now you're working for the FSB. The FSB is taking control. Now, it's worth noticing that all of this is happening on the backdrop of a country that is having significant economic problem. The state budget is simply breaking. The state is failing to pay its workers. 13% of Russian households can now only afford to buy food. That number is up. Volunteer enlistment has totally dried up. The state must now use threats to get people to join its military. Security teams are now raiding airports to find draft dodgers. This is not normal. Things in Russia, quite obviously, if you look at it from the outside, are getting worse. So the strategic bottom line is this. Russia today cannot endure as it is. The FSB is fighting a war against its own people. It quite clearly does not care what this means for the future of Russia. It does not care what this means for the war in Ukraine. It cares about stripping the war machine from within, about guaranteeing that they seize control, that they have power. So what this means for Ukraine is severalfold. On one side, it's a bad thing. It's bad because now the Russian military isn't even trying to make objectives. It's trying to defend itself. The Russian military is only worried about persecution. This means that they're not paying attention to what's happening to their soldiers. They don't care if they're throwing away more of them. This is good on the other side, because the more that the generals are obsessed with what is going on back in Moscow, the more that the FSB, that it has no military background, is making decisions for the military, the better things are. The more out of order the Russian military becomes, the harder it will be for the Russian military to make gains. But this is probably not so surprising. Do you remember when Kursk was still under Ukrainian occupation? Vladimir Putin by then had already lost his faith in the Russian military. He already assigned the FSB, not the Russian military, to be in charge of expelling the Ukrainians. This is just one more sign that Vladimir Putin himself is siding with the FSB against the military. The military had guaranteed him a 3-day war, and that hasn't really worked out as promised. So increasingly, over time, we will probably see more conflict within Moscow. But there's something else here that is truly important. As we've discussed many times, all of these things are what we would expect to see in a state that is truly collapsing. And this is not just some sort of a literary expression that this is terrible. In fact, this is not normal. This is not the way that countries typically operate. This is how countries operate when they are collapsing, when they are eating themselves. And this cannibalism within the system, it will get worse. It is definitely not going to get better, because the FSB has nothing to lose. Their objective is not to help Russia, not to help the Russian military win. It is to make sure that they have the power and the money. So going forward, what we'll see next is hard to predict, of course. But if these things continue as it could be, we are certainly setting the way to see serious pushback from the military. Because if you're a military general and you realize that one day they're going to come knock on your door, one day you too will go to prison for corruption, because you know that they know. Then what are you waiting for? Why not act now to make sure that that day would never come? So for right now, the Putin regime, it is ever more on thin ice. And as it skates around, it might act cool, it might act calm, it might act collected. But the situation in Russia tells a very different story. The situation in Russia is truly growing quite dangerous. And in the end, we might be much closer to the end of the Putin regime than you could possibly imagine. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, please subscribe to the channel, and leave your comments below. Let me know what you think. And as always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.